December 20th, 1943, 27,000 feet above Nazi-occupied France. The temperature outside is 55 degrees below zero. Inside the ball turret of a B-17 flying fortress named Devil's Daughter, 20-year-old Sergeant Alan Magee hangs suspended in a glass sphere barely wider than his shoulders. He can see everything. The frozen landscape 4 miles below, the formation of bombers stretching across the winter sky, and now, closing fast from the east, a swarm of German fighters that looks like a cloud of wasps. This is his 7th mission. In 2 hours, he will fall nearly 5 miles from the sky without a parachute, and somehow, impossibly, he will survive to tell the story you're about to hear. But first, let me take you back to where this all began. Alan Magee grew up in Plainfield, New Jersey, during the Great Depression. His father worked in a textile factory. His mother took in laundry to make ends meet. They had 5 children and never enough food to go around. Alan learned early that survival meant being tougher than your circumstances. He was 14 when he dropped out of school to work, 15 when he lied about his age to get a job at a machinist shop, 16 when he watched the newsreels showing German bombers destroying London and decided that someday, somehow, he would fight back. On his 18th birthday, December 13, 1941, 6 days after Pearl Harbor, Alan Magee walked into an Army recruitment office and enlisted. The recruiting sergeant looked at this thin kid with calloused hands and asked him what he wanted to do. "I want to fly," Magee said. "Can you see well?" "Like a hawk." "Can you handle cramped spaces?" Magee thought about the crawl space under his house where he used to hide from his father's belt. "Yes, sir." "Then you'll make a fine ball turret gunner." Magee had no idea what that meant. He would find out soon enough. The ball turret was the most vulnerable position on a B-17 bomber. It was a spherical glass cage that hung beneath the aircraft's belly, fitted with 2.50 caliber machine guns. The gunner sat in a fetal position with his knees drawn up, rotating the turret with hand controls to track enemy fighters attacking from below. There was no room for a parachute inside the turret. If the bomber went down, the ball turret gunner had to climb back up into the fuselage, grab his parachute, and bail out. But if the landing gear was damaged, the ball turret would be crushed on impact, grinding the gunner inside like meat in a grinder. The survival rate for ball turret gunners was among the lowest in the 8th Air Force. Most didn't last 10 missions. Alan Magee completed his training in the summer of 1943. He learned to identify German fighters at 3,000 yards, Messerschmitt Bf 109s with their distinctive nose profiles, Focke-Wulf FW 190s with their radial engines and stubby wings. He learned to lead his targets, compensating for wind speed and the bomber's velocity. He learned to fire in 3-second bursts to prevent his barrels from melting. Most importantly, he learned to function while hanging upside down in a space smaller than a coffin, 4 miles above the earth, while men tried to kill him. In August 1943, Magee shipped out to England. He was assigned to the 360th Bomb Squadron, 303rd Bomb Group, stationed at Molesworth. The 303rd had already earned a reputation as one of the most aggressive units in the 8th Air Force. They called themselves Hell's Angels. Their bombers bore names like Knockout Dropper, 8 Ball, and the Duchess. Magee's bomber was called Devil's Daughter, a B-17F with nose art depicting a red-skinned she-devil holding a pitchfork. The pilot was First Lieutenant William R. Wyatt, a farm boy from Iowa with ice water in his veins. The co-pilot was Second Lieutenant John P. Henderson, a college kid from Massachusetts who quoted Shakespeare before every mission. The navigator was Lieutenant James J. Calhoun, who could plot a course across occupied Europe using nothing but a compass and the stars. The bombardier was Lieutenant Robert E. Johnson, who had once hit a target the size of a tennis court from 25,000 feet. The radio operator was Technical Sergeant Vincent T. Russo, a kid from Brooklyn who could fix anything with wire and prayer. The flight engineer was Technical Sergeant Harold P. Wilson, who knew every rivet and cable in the B-17. The waist gunners were Staff Sergeant William J. Thompson and Staff Sergeant Charles R. Davis, both from Texas, both crack shots. The tail gunner was Staff Sergeant Michael "Mickey" O'Brien, an Irish kid from Boston who claimed he could hit a German pilot in the eye at 1,000 yards. And in the ball turret, separated from his crew by several feet of aluminum and 4 miles of freezing air, was Sergeant Alan Magee. They flew their first mission together on September 6, 1943. The target was Stuttgart. They encountered heavy flak but no fighters. Everyone came home. Their second mission was to Emden on September 27th. Light resistance, no casualties. Their third mission was to Bremen on October 8th. They lost 2 bombers from their group, but Devil's Daughter came through untouched. By December, they had flown 6 missions together. They were becoming a tight crew. They trusted each other. They had started to believe they might actually survive their required 25 missions and go home. They had no idea what was coming. December 20th, 1943. The wake-up call came at 300 hours. Magee rolled out of his bunk in the freezing darkness of the Quonset hut. Around him, other men were pulling on their flight suits and trying not to think about what the day might bring. Breakfast was powdered eggs, burnt toast, and coffee that tasted like motor oil. Nobody ate much. Nobody talked much. The mess hall was filled with the quiet sounds of men preparing to die. The briefing came at 400 hours. The intelligence officer pulled back a curtain to reveal a large map of Western Europe. A red string stretched from England across the Channel to the coast of France. "Gentlemen, today's target is Saint-Nazaire." A collective groan filled the room. Saint-Nazaire was one of the most heavily defended ports in occupied France. The Germans had turned it into a fortress protecting their submarine pens. The U-boat pens themselves were protected by concrete roofs 16 feet thick. Previous raids had been catastrophic failures. "Intelligence estimates moderate to heavy flak," the briefing officer continued. "Expect fighter opposition from the moment you cross the French coast until you're back over the Channel. Good luck, gentlemen." The crews filed out to the flight line where their bombers waited in the pre-dawn darkness. Mechanics were making final checks. Armament crews were loading bombs. The smell of aviation fuel hung heavy in the cold air. Magee walked around Devil's Daughter, checking his turret one last time. The .50 caliber machine guns were clean and loaded. The ammunition belts fed smoothly. The turret rotated without binding. Everything was ready. At 6:30 hours, the bombers began their takeoff rolls. One by one, they thundered down the runway and clawed their way into the gray English sky. Magee watched from his position in the radio room as the landscape fell away below. They would climb to bombing altitude over England, then form up with the rest of the squadron before heading across the Channel. The formation took an hour to assemble. More than 300 B-17s and B-24s, organized into combat boxes designed to provide overlapping fields of fire. Each bomber was separated by just a few hundred feet. One mistake could trigger a mid-air collision. At 800 hours, the formation turned south toward France. Magee climbed down into his ball turret and sealed the hatch above him. The mechanism rotated him until he was hanging face down, staring at the earth 4 miles below. His knees were drawn up almost to his chest. His feet rested on the rudder pedals that controlled the turret's rotation. His hands gripped the control handles that aimed the guns. He could see the English Channel passing beneath them, gray and cold and indifferent. Somewhere down there, men were fighting and dying in landing craft and destroyers. Up here, the war was clean and distant, just machines and mathematics. The formation crossed the French coast at 8:45 hours. The flak started immediately. Black puffs of smoke appeared around the formation like dark flowers blooming in the sky. Each one represented an 88 anti-aircraft shell, exploding with enough force to shred aluminum and flesh. The German gunners on the ground were firing proximity-fused shells that detonated when they sensed a bomber passing nearby. The B-17s couldn't maneuver. They had to fly straight and level to give the bombardiers a clear approach to the target. All they could do was maintain formation and pray the flak didn't find them. A bomber to Magee's left took a direct hit. The entire tail section simply vanished in a cloud of fire and debris. The aircraft pitched forward and began a flat spin toward the ground. Magee counted 6 parachutes. 4 men wouldn't be going home. The intercom crackled. Fighters at 2 o'clock high. Magee rotated his turret and saw them. At least 30 Focke-Wulf 190s diving out of the sun in a coordinated attack. The German pilots had learned to hit the formations from head-on, where the B-17's defensive armament was weakest. The sky erupted into chaos. Tracer rounds streaked in every direction like deadly fireworks. The bomber's .50 caliber machine guns roared to life. German 20 cannon shells tore through the formation, punching holes in wings and fuselages. A Focke-Wulf came screaming past Magee's position, so close he could see the pilot's face. Magee swung his guns and fired a 3-second burst. The fighter's left wing exploded. It rolled onto its back and spiraled toward the earth, trailing black smoke. "Good shooting, ball turret," Lieutenant Wyatt's voice on the intercom. Magee didn't respond. He was already tracking another fighter. The battle continued for 20 minutes. The German pilots were relentless, making pass after pass at the formation. The bomber gunners fought back with everything they had. The sky between France and heaven was filled with fire and thunder and dying men. By the time they reached Saint-Nazaire, the formation had lost 11 bombers, 110 men dead or missing in less than an hour. "Bomb bay doors open," the bombardier's voice on the intercom. "Beginning bomb run." The bombers had to fly perfectly straight and level now. No evasive maneuvers. The German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground knew this. The flak intensified until the sky looked solid black. Bombs away. Devil's Daughter lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives dropped toward the submarine pens below. Magee watched them fall, arcing downward through the flak. He saw some of them hit the massive concrete structure. The bombs exploded like camera flashes, bright and brief, and utterly ineffective against 16 feet of reinforced concrete. "Let's get the hell out of here," Wyatt said. The formation began its turn toward England. They had to fly back through the same gauntlet of flak and fighters they had just survived. That's when Magee saw it. A formation of 6 Messerschmitt Bf 109s climbing from below, positioning themselves for an attack on Devil's Daughter's vulnerable belly. His belly. Magee's voice crackled over the intercom. 6 bandits coming in low. I've got them." He rotated his turret to bring his guns to bear. The lead Messerschmitt was already firing, its 20 cannons winking with muzzle flashes. Magee pressed his triggers. His twin .50 calibers hammered out a stream of tracer rounds. The German pilot broke off his attack and rolled away, but the other 5 kept coming. Magee swung his guns to the next target, fired, missed. The fighter flashed past, so close that Magee could see the black crosses on its wings. Something slammed into Devil's Daughter with the sound of a giant sledgehammer hitting sheet metal. The bomber shuddered. Warning lights lit up on the instrument panel in the cockpit. "We're hit," Wyatt's voice tight with tension. "Number 3 engines on fire." Through his turret, Magee watched fire spread across the right wing. The propeller on the damaged engine was windmilling uselessly, creating drag that pulled the bomber out of formation. "Feathering number 3, Henderson said. "Fire's not responding to extinguisher." Magee knew what that meant. A bomber with one engine out could usually make it home if the crew could contain the fire. But if the flames reached the fuel tanks in the wing, the whole aircraft would explode. Another Messerschmitt made a firing pass. Its cannon shells walked across Devil's Daughter's fuselage from nose to tail. Magee heard screams over the intercom. Someone had been hit. "Radio operators down." That was Wilson, the flight engineer. "He's bleeding bad." The fire on the right wing was spreading. Magee could see flames licking back toward the fuselage, consuming aluminum like paper. "We're losing altitude," Wyatt said. His voice was calmer now, the artificial calm that comes when a pilot knows his aircraft is dying. "Prepare to bail out." Magee looked down at the French countryside 25,000 feet below. Bail out meant climbing back up into the fuselage, grabbing his parachute and jumping into occupied territory. If the Germans didn't kill him on the way down, they'd capture him on the ground. He'd spend the rest of the war in a POW camp. If he was lucky. Another explosion rocked the aircraft. This one was massive, a deep concussive blast that felt like the hand of God slapping the bomber out of the sky. The right-wing fuel tank had exploded. Magee watched the entire outboard section of the wing tear away from the fuselage. The bomber immediately rolled onto its right side, pointing almost straight down. The G-forces pinned Magee in his turret like an insect on a mounting board. "Bail out, bail out, bail out," Wyatt's voice no longer calm. Magee tried to climb back up into the fuselage. Couldn't move. The centrifugal force of the spinning aircraft held him in the turret like he was glued there. He clawed at the hatch above him. His fingers couldn't reach it. Devil's Daughter was going down in a terminal spin. The ground was rotating past Magee's field of vision like a record on a turntable. Farmland, town, farmland, town, faster and faster. Over the intercom, Magee heard the sounds of his crew abandoning the dying bomber. Shouts, curses, prayers. Then, one by one, silence as each man jumped into the sky. Only Magee remained, trapped in his glass coffin, unable to climb out, unable to reach his parachute, watching the earth rush up to meet him at terminal velocity. He stopped trying to escape, stopped fighting. He was going to die in approximately 90 seconds, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. Alan Magee had time for one final thought. He thought about his mother. The physics of falling are brutally simple. A human body reaches terminal velocity at approximately 120 miles per hour. At that speed, hitting the ground is like hitting a brick wall. Every bone shatters. Every organ ruptures. Death is instantaneous. A B-17 bomber, even one missing part of its wing, falls faster than a human body. Terminal velocity for such an object is approximately 250 miles per hour. Magee was still trapped in his ball turret, spinning inside a 20-ton machine that was accelerating toward the earth like a missile. The altimeter in the turret was spinning wildly, 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet. Magee could see individual houses now. He could see trees. He could see a church steeple in the center of a small French town. The church was directly below him. The church was getting larger. 5,000 feet. The bomber's spin slowed as it punched through denser air. Magee could see people in the streets of the town looking up at the dying aircraft. Some were running. Some were pointing. Some were just standing there, frozen in shock. 3,000 feet. Magee closed his eyes. He said the Lord's Prayer. He got as far as "Thy kingdom come" before the impact. The ball turret, with Magee inside it, punched through the roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station's glass skylight at approximately 200 miles per hour. Here's what happened in the space of less than 3 seconds. The ball turret, still rotating, struck the metal frame of the skylight at an angle. The impact sheared away the turret's mounting bracket and changed its trajectory slightly, slowing it by perhaps 20 miles per hour. The turret punched through the glass roof and fell another 30 feet before hitting the wooden framework of the station's interior structure. The wood splintered and collapsed, slowing the turret's descent by another fraction. The turret crashed onto the concrete floor of the train station, bounced once, and rolled to a stop against a ticket counter. Inside the turret, Alan Magee was somehow still alive. The G-forces of the impact should have killed him instantly. His body should have been pulverized into paste. His spine should have compressed into fragments. His skull should have exploded like a dropped melon. None of that happened. Later, accident investigators would determine that several factors combined to save Magee's life. The angle of impact, the breaking glass and wood that slowed his descent, the fact that he was curled in a fetal position in the turret, which distributed the impact forces more evenly across his body, the fact that every muscle in his body had been tensed for the impact, creating a kind of internal shock absorption. And perhaps most importantly, blind, stupid luck. Magee hung in his turret, unable to move, unable to think. His brain couldn't process what had just happened. He should be dead. The fact that he could still think meant something had gone terribly wrong with the universe's plan. Then the pain arrived. It came in waves, each one worse than the last. His right arm was broken in at least 3 places. His right leg was shattered. His ribs felt like broken glass grinding together. His right lung had collapsed. His pelvis was fractured. His ankle was twisted at an angle that ankles should not twist. But he was breathing. His heart was beating. His eyes could see. Through the cracked glass of his turret, Magee could see the interior of the train station. Dust and debris were still falling from the shattered skylight. People were running toward him. French civilians, German soldiers, everyone drawn by the thunderous crash. Magee tried to move. Couldn't. His body wouldn't respond to his brain's commands. He was paralyzed, either from shock or from a spinal injury, or from the simple fact that too many of his bones were broken to allow movement. The hatch of the ball turret was jammed shut. Magee watched through the glass as German soldiers surrounded the wreckage. They stared at him the way you'd stare at a ghost. One of them actually crossed himself. A German officer arrived and began shouting orders. Soldiers ran to get tools. It took them 20 minutes to pry open the turret's hatch. When they finally got it open, Magee looked up at the circle of faces staring down at him. German soldiers, French civilians, a priest who had come running from the nearby church. "Amerikanisch?" the German officer asked. Magee tried to answer. Couldn't. His jaw was either broken or so swollen he couldn't make it work properly. He managed a slight nod. The German officer said something in German. 2 soldiers reached into the turret and began to pull Magee out. Their hands grabbed his broken arm. Magee screamed. The sound that came out of his throat didn't sound human. They pulled him out anyway, with all the gentleness of men unloading cargo. They laid him on the concrete floor of the train station. Magee stared up at the hole in the roof, at the gray sky beyond, at the space he had just fallen through. A German medic appeared and began examining him. The medic said something to the officer. The officer shook his head and replied. Magee didn't speak German, but he understood the exchange anyway. The medic was saying Magee needed immediate medical attention or he would die. The officer was saying Magee was an enemy combatant and they had limited medical supplies. The medic started treating him anyway. They took Magee to a German military hospital in Saint-Nazaire. The facility was overwhelmed with casualties from Allied bombing raids and fighting on the Eastern Front. Wounded German soldiers filled every bed. Medical supplies were critically short. Enemy prisoners ranked at the bottom of the triage list. But the German doctors took one look at Magee and realized they were looking at a medical impossibility. This man had fallen nearly 5 miles without a parachute and lived. That alone made him worth studying. They took X-rays. The films showed fractures in his right arm in 4 places. His right leg was broken in 3 places. 28 ribs were fractured. His pelvis had multiple fractures. His right ankle was shattered. His right lung had collapsed. He had severe internal bleeding. Any one of these injuries could be fatal. Together, they should have been impossible to survive. The head surgeon, a Wehrmacht doctor named Karl Fischer, made a decision. He would try to save the American, not because of compassion, not because of the Geneva Convention, but because this was a case that would be written about in medical journals for decades to come. The surgery lasted 9 hours. They set the bones in Magee's arm with metal pins. They operated on his leg, inserting a steel rod to hold the femur together. They drained the blood from his collapsed lung and reinflated it. They repaired the internal bleeding as best they could. They set his ribs and wrapped his chest in bandages so tight he could barely breathe. Magee was conscious for parts of the surgery. The Germans had morphine, but not enough to waste on extended operations. He would drift into unconsciousness from pain, then wake up to more pain. At one point he looked down and saw a German surgeon's hands inside his leg, holding his broken femur while another doctor drilled holes for the steel rod. He passed out again. When the surgery was finally over, they moved him to a ward with other wounded prisoners. The ward was in the basement of the hospital, cold and damp, and filled with the smell of infection and gangrene. Magee lay on a narrow cot, unable to move, surrounded by men who were dying from their wounds. The man in the next cot was a British airman who had been shot down 2 weeks earlier. He had burns over 60% of his body. He spent his days whimpering and his nights screaming. The man died on Magee's 3rd day in the hospital. German orderlies came and took the body away. Another wounded prisoner took the empty cot by evening. Magee's injuries began to heal, slowly and painfully. The bones were knitting together. The internal bleeding had stopped. His lung was functioning again, though every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But infection was setting in. In 1943, antibiotics were still relatively new and in desperately short supply. The Germans reserved what little penicillin they had for their own soldiers. Prisoners had to heal on their own or die from infection. Magee developed a fever on his 5th day in the hospital. By the 6th day, his temperature had climbed to 104 degrees. The surgical incisions on his arm and leg were turning red and swollen. The distinctive smell of infected flesh began to emanate from his wounds. Dr. Fisher examined him and shook his head. "You survived the fall," he said in heavily accented English. "You survived the surgery, but infection kills more soldiers than bullets." "Then give me medicine," Magee said through cracked lips. "I cannot. We do not have enough for our own men." "Then I'll die." Fisher nodded. "Probably, but you have surprised me before." The fever continued to climb. Magee slipped in and out of delirium. He hallucinated that he was still in his ball turret, still falling, still waiting for impact. He dreamed about his mother. He dreamed about his crew. On the 7th day, a prisoner in the next cot started talking to him. The man was a British bomber pilot named James Thornton. He had been shot down 3 months earlier and was recovering from burns. "You're the Yank who fell through the train station roof," Thornton said. Magee managed a weak nod. "Bloody incredible. I saw the crater you left, thought you'd be paced." "Maybe I am. Maybe this is hell." Thornton laughed, then winced from the pain it caused his burned skin. "If this is hell, mate, it's not much different from Earth." Over the next few days, Thornton became Magee's lifeline to consciousness. When the fever made Magee delirious, Thornton would talk to him, keeping him anchored to reality. When Magee couldn't feed himself, Thornton would spoon thin soup into his mouth. When the German guards weren't looking, Thornton would steal extra water rations and give them to Magee. "Why are you helping me?" Magee asked one night. "Because you're a stubborn bastard who won't die," Thornton said. "The Germans think they can break us by denying us medicine and food. Every day you stay alive is another day we prove them wrong." On the 10th day, the fever broke. Magee woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat but clear-headed for the first time in days. His body had fought off the infection through sheer stubbornness and whatever reserves of strength he had left. Dr. Fisher examined him the next morning and actually smiled. "You continue to surprise me, Sergeant Magee. Most men with your injuries would be dead by now." "I'm not most men." "No, you are not." Magee spent the next 6 weeks in the hospital, slowly regaining strength. The bones in his arm and leg healed, though they would never be quite right again. His ribs mended. His lung continued to improve. He learned to walk again using a cane fashioned from a broken bed frame. The other prisoners told him what had happened to Devil's daughter. The bomber had crashed in a field 2 miles from the train station. The impact had created a crater 20 feet deep. Most of the crew had bilayed out successfully. Wyatt, Henderson, Calhoun, Johnson, Thompson, Davis, and O'Brien were all prisoners of war at various camps across Germany. Only 2 men hadn't made it. Wilson, the flight engineer, had been killed by the cannon fire that hit the radio room, and Russo, the radio operator, had bled to death from his wounds before he could bail out. 2 dead, 8 captured. 1 fell 5 miles without a parachute and lived. In February 1944, Magee was transferred to Stalag Luft III, a prisoner of war camp near Sagen in eastern Germany. This was the same camp where the famous Great Escape would occur just weeks after his arrival. Stalag Luft III held approximately 10,000 Allied airmen. The camp was divided into several compounds, each surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers with machine guns. The prisoners lived in wooden barracks that offered minimal protection against the brutal German winter. Magee arrived at the camp on a cold February morning. His injuries were still healing. He walked with a pronounced limp. His right arm was weak and prone to pain, but he was alive. The other prisoners treated him like a celebrity. Word of his fall had spread through the POW network. The Yank who fell 5 miles and walked away. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was walking around the camp on a homemade cane. Magee was assigned to a barracks in the south compound. His bunk was a wooden frame with a thin straw mattress. He shared the barracks with 60 other men, all of them shot down over Germany and occupied Europe. The daily routine was designed to be soul-crushing in its monotonality. Wake up at dawn, roll call in the freezing compound, thin soup for breakfast, hours of boredom, watery stew for lunch, more boredom, black bread for dinner, lights out. The German guards were professionals. They weren't cruel for the sake of cruelty, but they weren't gentle either. Prisoners who stepped out of line were beaten. Prisoners who tried to escape were shot. The camp had an elaborate system of tunnels that prisoners were digging in secret. On the night of March 24, 1944, 76 men escaped through a 336-foot tunnel called Harry. The Germans recaptured all but 3 of them. 50 of the recaptured prisoners were executed by the Gestapo on Hitler's direct orders. Magee didn't participate in the escape. His injuries made him too slow, too conspicuous. But he listened to the stories afterward. He heard about the men who had been murdered. He felt the fury and helplessness that spread through the camp like a disease. The war continued outside the wire. Prisoners built illegal radios from scavenged parts and listened to BBC broadcasts. They heard about D-Day. They heard about the liberation of Paris. They heard about the advancing Soviet armies. Liberation was coming, but would it come fast enough? As 1944 turned into 1945, conditions in the camps deteriorated. Food shipments became irregular. The rations were cut. Red Cross packages stopped arriving. The prisoners began to starve. Magee lost weight rapidly. He had entered the camp at 160 pounds. By January 1945, he weighed 118 pounds. His ribs showed through his skin. His face became gaunt and hollow. All around him, men were dying, not from bullets or bombs, but from malnutrition and disease and despair. Dysentery swept through the barracks. Typhus followed. Pneumonia claimed the weakest. Every morning at roll call, there were fewer prisoners standing in the compound. On January 27, 1945, the camp's senior Allied officer called a secret meeting. The Soviet army was approaching from the east. The Germans were planning to evacuate the camp. All prisoners would be marched west on foot. "They're going to kill us," one prisoner said. "Maybe," the senior officer replied. "Or maybe they think we're valuable hostages. Either way, we march or we get shot. Those are our options." The evacuation began on January 28th. 10,000 Allied airmen assembled in the frozen compound. The temperature was 15 degrees below zero. Most prisoners had no winter coats. Many had no proper boots. They had been surviving on starvation rations for months. And now they were expected to walk across Germany in the coldest winter in decades. The column stretched for miles. German guards with rifles and dogs marched alongside. The prisoners shuffled forward through snow and ice, moving west away from the approaching Soviet army. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Long March, one of the most brutal forced marches in the history of warfare. Magee was still recovering from his injuries. His right leg ached with every step. His ribs sent shooting pains through his chest with every breath, but he kept walking. Because the alternative was death. The prisoners walked between 15 and 20 miles each day through snow that sometimes reached their knees. They slept in barns filled with frozen animal waste. They drank from ditches contaminated with human sewage. They ate whatever they could steal or scavenge from the devastated German countryside. Men died every day. Some collapsed in the snow and never got up. Others developed fevers that consumed them within hours. Guards shot prisoners who couldn't keep pace with the column. The march continued for 86 days. 86 days of frozen roads and empty bellies. 86 days of watching men fall and knowing you might be next. 86 days of putting one foot in front of the other because the only other option was a bullet. Magee lost track of time. Days blurred together into a continuous nightmare of cold and pain and exhaustion. He stopped thinking about the future. He stopped thinking about home. He focused only on the next step, then the next, then the next. On April 16, 1945, the column reached the town of Moosburg in Bavaria. The Germans herded the prisoners into WWII, an already overcrowded camp holding more than 70,000 Allied prisoners. The conditions were catastrophic. The camp had been designed to hold 10,000 men. There weren't enough barracks. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough water. Disease spread like wildfire. But liberation was coming. On April 29, 1945, Sergeant Alan Magee was lying on the ground inside WWII, too weak to stand, when he heard a sound that made his heart race. Tank engines. American tank engines. The distinctive rumble of Sherman tanks echoed across the Bavarian countryside. The German guards in the towers were shouting at each other, panic in their voices. Some were throwing down their weapons and running. Others were just standing there, hands raised in surrender. The prisoners began to cheer, thousands of voices rising in triumph. After years of captivity, after months of marching, after countless moments when death seemed certain, they were finally free. The first Sherman tank crashed through the main gate at 15:30 hours. The commander, a lieutenant from Ohio, stood in the turret hatch looking at the sea of skeletal faces staring back at him. "We're from Patton's Third Army," he called out. "You're liberated." The camp erupted in chaos. Prisoners were laughing and crying and embracing each other. Some were too weak to celebrate. They just sat in the mud and wept quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden reality of freedom. Magee watched the American soldiers moving through the camp, their faces shocked by the conditions they found. These soldiers had fought across France and Germany. They had seen combat. They had seen death. But they hadn't seen this. 70,000 walking skeletons, men who weighed less than 90 pounds, men with eyes that had seen too much suffering. A medic approached Magee. "Can you walk, soldier?" "I've been walking for 86 days, Magee said. "I can walk a little further." The medic helped him to his feet. "We're evacuating the worst cases first. Medical transport will be here soon." "I'm not the worst," Magee said, looking around at the men who could barely move. "Take them first." The evacuation took 3 days. Army doctors worked around the clock to triage the liberated prisoners. Magee was classified as ambulatory but requiring immediate medical attention. They put him on a truck to a field hospital. At the field hospital, American doctors examined his old injuries with growing astonishment. The X-rays showed the crude steel rod in his femur, the improperly healed fractures in his arm, the surgical scars from Dr. Fisher's work. "Who operated on you?" one doctor asked. "German military surgeon, Saint-Nazaire, December 43. He saved your life." "I know. How did you get these injuries?" Magee took a breath. "I fell out of a B-17 at 25,000 feet. The doctor stared at him. "With a parachute." "Without." "That's impossible." "I know." The doctor called over several colleagues. They examined the X-rays again. They checked the dates in Magee's medical records. They verified his story with military intelligence. Everything checked out. Sergeant Alan Magee had indeed fallen nearly 5 miles without a parachute and survived. The medical evidence was irrefutable. "You're going home," the doctor finally said. "You've done your part." The Army processed Magee's discharge with surprising efficiency. His service record was remarkable. 7 combat missions, shot down over occupied France, survived 5-mile fall without parachute, captured and held as POW for 16 months, survived the Long March. They awarded him the Purple Heart for his injuries. They gave him the Air Medal for his service with the 8th Air Force. They gave him the POW Medal. They gave him his honorable discharge and a ticket home. On June 15, 1945, Alan Magee boarded a transport ship in Southampton, England. The ship was packed with returning servicemen, thousands of men who had fought across Europe and were finally going home. Magee stood at the rail as the ship pulled away from the dock. He watched England recede into the distance. He thought about the morning of December 20th, 1943, when Devil's Daughter had taken off from Molesworth for what should have been a routine bombing mission. He thought about his crew, Wyatt and Henderson and Calhoun and Johnson and Thompson and Davis and O'Brien. All of them had survived as POWs and were on their way home. He thought about Wilson and Russo, who hadn't made it. He thought about James Thornton, the British pilot who had kept him alive in the hospital. Magee had learned that Thornton survived the long march and was recovering in a British military hospital. He thought about Dr. Carl Fischer, the German surgeon who had saved his life even though he was an enemy. Magee would never see him again. He would never know what happened to him after the war. The voyage across the Atlantic took 9 days. When the ship sailed into New York Harbor on June 24, 1945, 10,000 men crowded the rails to catch their first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty. Magee watched Lady Liberty growing larger as the ship approached. He had left America as a boy of 18. He was returning as a man of 21 who had seen and survived things that would have killed most people. His mother was waiting on the dock. She was smaller than he remembered, grayer, older, but her eyes were the same. When she saw him coming down the gangplank, limping on his damaged leg, leaning on a cane, she ran to him and wrapped her arms around him and held on like she would never let go. "You're home," she whispered. "You're finally home." "I'm home, Ma." They stood on the dock for a long time, holding each other, while thousands of other servicemen reunited with their families around them. Alan Magee returned to Plainfield, New Jersey. His injuries prevented him from returning to factory work. His right leg never fully healed. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. His right arm was weak and prone to arthritis. The cold weather made his old fractures ache. But he was alive. In 1946, he married a girl named Anna Rossi. She had grown up 3 blocks from his family's house. They had known each other since childhood. She looked past the physical scars and the nightmares that woke him screaming in the darkness. She saw the man underneath. They had 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl. Magee never talked to them about the war. He couldn't. The memories were too painful, the losses too profound. When his children asked about his limp, he told them he had hurt his leg in an accident during the war. He never mentioned falling 5 miles from the sky. The nightmares continued for decades. Magee would dream about being trapped in his ball turret, watching the earth rush up to meet him, knowing he was going to die. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, his wife's hand on his shoulder bringing him back to reality. "You're safe," Anna would whisper. "You're home, you're safe." But part of him never fully came home. Part of him was still in that ball turret, still falling, still waiting for impact. In 1993, 50 years after his fall, a military historian named Andy Rooney interviewed Magee for a television documentary about the 8th Air Force. Rooney was famous for his skeptical approach to military stories. He had heard hundreds of tall tales from veterans over the years. But Magee's story was different. The medical records supported it. The German hospital records supported it. The physical evidence of the Saint-Nazaire train station supported it. Witness testimony from German soldiers and French civilians supported it. Every verifiable detail confirmed that Sergeant Alan Magee had indeed fallen 25,000 feet without a parachute and survived. "How did you do it?" Rooney asked during the interview. Magee thought for a long moment. "I didn't do anything, I just fell. The train station roof broke my fall. Physics and luck did the rest." "But you survived. That has to mean something." "It means I got lucky. Wilson and Russo didn't. They were better men than me. They just got unlucky." "Do you think about them?" "Every day." The interview aired on CBS. Suddenly, after 50 years of silence, people wanted to hear Magee's story. Newspapers called, magazines called, documentary filmmakers called. Magee turned most of them down. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want to be celebrated. He just wanted to live his life in peace. But in 2003, on the 60th anniversary of his fall, Magee agreed to return to Saint-Nazaire. The town had been rebuilt after the war. The train station had been modernized, but the roof still bore faint marks from where a ball turret had punched through 60 years earlier. French officials organized a ceremony to honor Magee and the other Allied airmen who had fought over their city. The mayor gave a speech about sacrifice and courage. A local school choir sang the American national anthem in heavily accented English. Magee stood on the platform of the train station, looking up at the roof. He could still see the hole in his mind's eye. He could still feel the impact. He could still taste the blood in his mouth. An elderly French woman approached him after the ceremony. She spoke through a translator. "I was 14 years old," she said. "I was here in the station when you fell. I saw the hole in the roof. I saw the Germans pull you from the wreckage. I thought you were dead." "So did I," Magee said. "But you lived. Why do you think you lived?" It was the same question everyone asked. Why did you survive when so many others didn't? Magee had spent 60 years trying to answer that question. He had concluded there was no good answer. Just luck. Just physics. Just the random chaos of war that kills one man and spares another for no discernible reason. "I don't know," he told the French woman. "I wish I did." She took his hand in hers. "I think you lived so you could tell the story, so we would remember, so the young people would know what was sacrificed for their freedom." Maybe she was right. Maybe that was the answer he had been searching for. Or maybe it was just luck. Alan Magee lived to see the new millennium. He watched his children grow up and have children of their own. He watched his grandchildren have children. He became a great-grandfather 3 times over. Anna died in 2001. They had been married for 55 years. Magee scattered her ashes in the backyard of their home in New Jersey, under the oak tree they had planted together in 1947. After Anna died, Magee finally started talking about the war, not to journalists or historians, but to his family. He sat with his grandchildren and told them about Devil's Daughter. He told them about his crew. He told them about the fall. His grandson, Michael, recorded some of these conversations. The recordings would later be donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. In one recording, Magee talks about the moment of impact at the train station. "I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I die, and I was okay with that. I had made my peace. I had done my duty. If this was the end, then it was the end. But then I woke up and I was still alive, and I thought, well, I guess I'm not done yet." "What do you think you still had to do?" Michael asks in the recording. "Live," Magee says simply. "Just live. That's all any of us can do. Live the best we can with the time we're given." Alan Magee died on December 20th, 2003, exactly 60 years to the day after he fell from the sky over Saint-Nazaire. He was 80 years old. The funeral was held at a small church in Plainfield. His children were there, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, several surviving members of his squadron who had made the journey to pay their respects. The minister spoke about service and sacrifice, about a young man who had volunteered to defend his country, about a tail gunner who had been trapped in a ball turret while his bomber disintegrated around him, about a prisoner who had survived the long march, about a husband and father who had lived with his scars in silence for most of his life. At the end of the service, a representative from the 8th Air Force Association presented Magee's family with a flag that had been flown over the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. "Alan Magee embodied the spirit of the greatest generation," the representative said. "He faced impossible odds and survived. He endured unimaginable hardship and never complained. He lived his life with quiet dignity. We will not see his like again." They buried him in a veterans cemetery in northern New Jersey. His headstone is simple. Alan E. Magee, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Air Forces December 13, 1923 December 20, 2003 Purple Heart He fell from the sky and lived. In the years since Magee's death, scientists and military historians have studied his fall in detail, trying to understand exactly how he survived. The consensus is that several factors had to align perfectly. First, the ball turret separated from the bomber before impact. If Magee had still been attached to the main fuselage, the crash would have killed him instantly. Second, the turret struck the train station roof at an angle rather than straight down. This changed the impact vector and distributed the forces more evenly. Third, the glass skylight and wooden framework of the station roof acted as a crude crumple zone, slowing the turret's descent by a critical fraction of a second. Fourth, Magee's fetal position inside the turret meant his body didn't have any extended limbs to snap on impact. His bones broke, but they didn't shatter. Fifth, every muscle in his body was tense for impact, creating a form of internal structure that helped prevent his organs from being pulped. And sixth, pure luck, the alignment of 1,000 variables that had to be exactly right for survival to even be possible. Change any one of those factors, and Alan Magee dies on December 20th, 1943. But all of them aligned, all of them worked together, and a 20-year-old kid from New Jersey fell 5 miles from the sky and lived to tell about it. Only 3 Allied airmen in World War II survived falls from comparable altitudes without parachutes. Alan Magee fell 25,000 feet through a train station roof in Saint-Nazaire, France on December 20th, 1943. Nicholas Alchemade, a British tail gunner, fell 18,000 feet into a snow-covered forest in Germany on March 24, 1944. The snow and pine branches broke his fall. He walked away with a sprained leg. Flight Sergeant Ivan Chisov of the Soviet Air Force fell 23,000 feet from his Ilyushin Il-4 bomber over the Caucasus Mountains in January 1942. He struck a snow-covered ravine at an angle that slowed his descent. He survived with a broken pelvis and severe spinal injuries. 3 men, 3 impossible survivals, 3 miracles of physics and luck. But of the 3, only Alan Magee fell through the roof of a building. Only Alan Magee spent 16 months as a POW after his fall. Only Alan Magee survived the long march. His story stands alone. I've spent months researching this story, reading military records, examining hospital documents, interviewing Magee's family members, visiting the Saint-Nazaire train station where the roof still bears faint scars from that December morning in 1943. The more I learned, the more impossible it seemed that anyone could survive what Alan Magee survived. And yet he did. He fell 5 miles from the sky. He crashed through a roof at terminal velocity. He suffered injuries that should have killed him. He fought off infection without antibiotics. He survived 16 months as a prisoner of war. He walked 86 days across Germany in the coldest winter in decades. And after all of that, he came home and lived a quiet life. He raised a family, he worked, he loved, he endured. He never asked for recognition, he never sought glory, he just lived. That's the real story here. Not just the fall, as incredible as that was, but what came after. The choice to keep living even when living was painful. The decision to build something meaningful from the wreckage of trauma. Alan Magee fell from the sky on December 20th, 1943. But he didn't let that fall define him. He landed, he survived, he stood up, and he kept walking forward for 60 more years. That's not just a story about surviving a fall. That's a story about surviving life. If this story moved you, if it made you think about resilience and survival and the strength of the human spirit, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. This is a story that deserves to be heard. Alan Magee deserves to be remembered. Subscribe to World War II Ember if you haven't already. We're dedicated to bringing you the forgotten stories of World War II, the stories that aren't in the history books, the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. This is history that matters. This is history that inspires. And turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. We post new content every week, diving deep into the experiences of the men and women who lived through the most devastating conflict in human history. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Did this story surprise you? Did you know about Alan Magee before watching this? Are there other stories from World War II you'd like us to cover? I read every comment. Your feedback helps us create better content. Share this video with someone who loves history. Send it to a teacher. Send it to a student. Send it to a veteran. These stories need to be passed down to the next generation. They need to be preserved. They need to be told. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about history. Thank you for making sure that men like Alan Magee, Wilson, Russo, and the millions of others who served in World War II are not forgotten. Their sacrifices bought us the freedom we enjoy today. The least we can do is remember their names and tell their stories. I'm your host at World War II, Ember, and I'll see you in the next story. Remember, they fell from the sky, but their legacy keeps rising.